How do you think that this current approach from the United States is actually impacting the Yemeni government and perceptions of its own legitimacy and credibility as it's engaged and partnered with the United States government in this campaign?
The Yemeni government and the president in specific have been always saying that they support the global war on terror and that they are partners with the U.S. in this, and that they even, as far as the president going and saying that all the drone strikes are happening with his authorization. And so definitely as a government, they are on board with the agenda of counterterrorism, but unfortunately that means that they are sort of limited in their response to the let's say U.S. Focus of things, which, as I mentioned, for example, drone strikes, attacks, campaigns against Al-Qaeda, as you mentioned in your introduction, where for a couple of weeks they would attack them in one village or in one area of Yemen, and then Al-Qaeda would move to a different area. And when Al-Qaeda would leave, the government would not really follow up with providing services in that area, making sure that people are well taken care of. But instead of that, usually in all those areas, there's a big lack of basic services, big lack of government presence after Al-Qaeda leaves. So that really doesn't help the situation.
And what do you think is really leading to the development of these extremist networks? I mean, the ability for these groups to recruit members, to continue growing their base, and to really find safe haven in a lot of these areas. What do you see as being the underlying causes or the drivers for this progressive development in Yemen?
It is very clear all across Yemen that the real issue that we have is the issue of the economy and the issue of the very high unemployment rates. So it is really no wonder that for a young person who has no chances at education, at finding a decent job, at providing having a livelihood, is a very easy target for recruitment by different militant groups, not only Al-Qaeda really. In Yemen, there's a number of other militant groups that youth have been joining because that's for them to earn a wage, have a meaning for their life, because really they don't have jobs. The economy is at a standstill. It is not creating any jobs, and the unemployment is just a staggering numbers.
Like what you're saying is that there's actually not very much of an ideological affinity here or motivation for why people are joining these groups and why it continues to pose a threat.
Sure, there is, for some people, an ideological reason or an ideological drive for them to join such groups. But again, the environment is very ripe for that. Because as I said, again, imagine you're a young person and you've got nothing at all, no future ahead of you, no job, and if someone comes and says, we will give you a reason to be proud and alive again, because you'll have a weapon and you'll be fighting against the injustices in the world, and give you all that talk, and we'll pay you a monthly salary, and we'll get you married, and get you a house. And then the alternative, if you don't do that, is for you to continue your daily life without a job, without a house, without being married, and you're a young male, usually. It's very tempting and easy to adopt that ideology once you are already coming from that background.
So given what you're outlining, the task ahead is pretty daunting in terms of trying to help build state institutions, to help provide better social services, to create more job opportunities. This is a massive, massive undertaking that will probably take decades to achieve, and certainly the international community has tried to rally around this cause, but it seems like we've not been terribly effective in really delivering results. What kind of advice might you give to U.S. policymakers about what we should be doing differently, or where we should be putting our resources, and how we should be investing more in Yemen?
I mean, as you said, this is not going to be a short-term thing to address the core reasons of the issue and of the problem at hand. So I believe Yemen should have, and the U.S. should support a twin track, policy against terrorism. Because on one side, yes, you need the short-term actions. You need to have the security forces quickly in place that can, make sure the Al-Qaeda is not growing, let's say. But on the second track, you need to be, as well as we discussed, providing the finances first. So funding is a big part of this, for the Yemeni government to be able to provide these services out to address now it's no longer an issue of development only, but it's also an issue of a humanitarian situation where people do not have enough water, enough food, they don't have shelter. There's hundreds of thousands of displaced people, internally displaced people in Yemen due to the conflicts. So we need to be thinking on this twin track of what do we do now to make sure the terrorist networks are not expanding, let's say, but what do we do as well to address the core issues that Yemen is facing to make sure that we have a way to sustainably address terrorism.
And at the same time that we're thinking about AQAP, and of course this is always central in the minds of military and intelligence officials, there's also this mounting tension in Sana'a and increasing crisis with the Houthi movement having taken over many positions in front of ministries and elsewhere throughout Sana'a and throughout other governorates in Yemen. How do you think the international community should respond, and the U.S. in particular, to this very aggressive action that's been taken? And yet the reality is they're on the ground and they're going to be part of the political playing field moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that part that I was mentioning earlier is that for the Yemeni people, the priority is not necessarily AQAP. I mean, yes, AQAP has lately, especially in the past 2-3 years, started attacks locally as well, but they are very few numbered. But the issue that the Yemeni people, the Yemeni citizens have to face every day is not AQAP, and it's not their first priority. It's not armed groups as Al-Houthi, as you mentioned, which lately has escalated their movement, and as you mentioned, entered into Sana'a. That presents a much bigger threat for the average Yemeni to worry about than AQAP. And so that is also part of the narrative, let's say, that is very rarely heard of from the U.S. Usually the Yemeni people, all they hear from the U.S. is about AQAP and counterterrorism, about AQAP, but not about the security situation in general in Yemen, all the other security threats facing the Yemeni people. And so, as you mentioned, the Houthis now represent a bigger issue for the Yemeni government and for the Yemeni people. They are now in the streets of Sana'a, that they are causing, havoc in the streets. It's a very organized movement, but still, it represents a threat right now. And how do we, how does the Yemeni government deal with that? How does the international community deal with that? Is what needs to be worked out. I mean, right now, as you know, the agreement was signed with the Houthis and all the political parties, and it's really about making sure that that agreement is implemented, including, handing back the heavy weapons that the Houthis took over from military camps, including them withdrawing from the cities, and including the government having its presence in all the areas of Yemen. And so that's what really the priority now for the Yemeni government. I think it will be very challenging to also maintain the focus on AQAP under these situation, and we have already seen it. AQAP is using this security void, let's say the occupation of the government with other issues for them to strengthen their positions in areas like Al-Bayda and Rada. And that's going to be really the challenge for the next few months, at least. How do we make sure that the security void is addressed as fast as possible?
It's an excellent point, and I would just reiterate how frequently that is missed. That in our narrow focus on what AQAP is doing, we have perhaps been insufficiently attentive to these other security issues. the sheer number of weapons that are being held by these groups that are not adhering to the letter of the law, and how that opens space for extremist groups, AQAP and others, to actually fill that gap. And so this is something that I think the U.S. really needs to think a little bit more strategically again about how we invest our time and resources in helping Yemen create a security framework that will address some of these other issues that are perhaps not as much on the forefront of our minds. Thanks very much for joining me, Rafat.